Hello and welcome to Comics in Context. I'm Mark.
I'm Derek.
And we're two historians who love comics. In this show, we aim to take a look at comics, old and modern, and put them in the context of the time in which they were written. Along the way, we may also have the chance to pick up some fun references. We're not looking to apologize for any content, and we realize that as time goes by, people use modern lenses to read older books. The more you study history, the less you realize you know. Let's get started with our summary of the issue.
All right, so today we're looking at Green Lantern number 87 from 1972, which is the first appearance of Green Lantern John Stewart. And so basically, in our summary, we're watching Hal. He's flying around in Southern California when an earthquake hits. He goes in and helps out a little bit, but then Guy Gardner, who is apparently kind of his backup on Earth, the backup Green Lantern, he gets injured from a bus crash and actually needs to be hospitalized for about 6 months. And so the Guardian then comes to Hal and says, uh-oh, we're going to have to figure out another backup plan. Hal doesn't think anyone else is going to be as good as Guy, but the Guardian has another plan. It's kind of implied that maybe it's Ganthet, but we're not really sure. They don't name the Guardian at that time. And so then he transports him to an unknown place. Apparently we find out later that this is actually in Detroit, and we meet John Stewart. And so Hal's initially a bit concerned about seeing a black man, and then he's being a little aggressive walking down the street. You can definitely see some stuff that we'll get into, 1970s black and white interactions. But then Hal agrees, takes him under his wing a little bit. They go through some training. They give John Stewart a kind of training ring. They don't exactly explain where he suddenly has a ring from, but he just does. And then they stop a couple crimes, deal with some racist senators, and then we see Hal somewhat, by the end of it, come to the idea that John Stewart may actually be a good Green Lantern. And then there's also a whole Green Arrow story in the backside that we're not going to talk about because we're not really big Green Arrow fans.
Yeah, neither of us read the Green Arrow issue. Sorry, Ollie fans.
But even if it's a good issue, that's not really the stuff that we wanted to get into, because there's a lot of really good stuff in the Green Lantern section.
Yeah. Well, with that, let's put the comic in context.
All right, so 1971, 1972, we're still in the core of Richard Nixon's presidency, Nixon era for sure, all the issues that can occur in that. In terms of the issue and money and all that kind of stuff, the issue is 25 cents. So still on the cheaper side for a nice 44 pages. It's pretty good. And then minimum wage at the time was $1.60. So at this point, your ratio is actually pretty good. You could afford comics pretty easily. That's 10 minutes of work or so, even before tax. Not bad at all.
Yeah, pretty affordable. I can imagine going to the spinner rack and a Woolworths or a 7-Eleven and comics being very affordable at the time.
Mm-hmm. You might pick up a couple because, you'd spend $1 on comics. That's not even your hourly wage.
Well, some of the bigger national and global events that were happening at the time, desegregationists like George Wallace, the governor of Alabama, was fighting the end of segregation in schools, actively fighting it, speaking out in public, in large forums, claiming that white children and black children should not go to school together, and he had all of his racist reasons. It was a very tense time of racial inequality in the U.S., for sure. 1971, not a calm time whatsoever. In fact, things got so bad with racial inequality that on the U.S. military side, the military was becoming scrutinized for its unequal treatment of black soldiers. Of course, that's not even to mention soldiers of other races as well. But specifically here, we're looking at John Stewart being a black character. But the unrest in the military got so bad that there were riots at Travis Air Force Base between black troops and white troops. So things were not calm in the nation. That was big news at the time. So I can imagine as this story is being written, we're paying attention to these details. Something else that I think does play in, although it doesn't really relate to the issues so much, is that in September of 71, the Attica prison riot happened. And Attica prison is in New York. 43 people died as a result of the riots, 39 of those killed by law enforcement. There were 10 law enforcement officers killed. 9 law enforcement officers were killed by law enforcement officers. So it was clearly a very chaotic event. But to the larger point, it's 33 prisoners died, the bulk of which were African American. And in Attica prison, 54% of the population was black. And what the riots started over was they were campaigning for better living conditions and more political rights. that's going to play into the racial tensions of the 1970s, which is why we thought it was important to bring up here. And lastly, earthquakes, Derek.
Oh, yes. So there's definitely earthquakes. If you live in California, Washington, Oregon, you know all about earthquakes. In February of 1971, the San Fernando quake was a 6.6. If you don't know earthquakes, that's a good quake.
That's a big one.
You're going to feel that for sure. It's going to do some damage. $550 million of damage, which would be $4.5 billion in 2026. So it was a really big quake down in LA. I'm sure people might remember that one, and you're always aware that there could be another big quake. And so I think starting this issue with a big quake was very timely in that way, not only just because we just came from one, but because we were always kind of being aware of one in the West Coast.
It sets the context for where we are. And one thing Derek and I disagreed on, he being from Northern California and me from Southern California, is, well, where exactly is Coast City?
Yes.
You think the context clues place him in the Bay Area?
Yes, as they're showing a little bit as they're walking around, it's looking a lot like Oakland, Berkeley to me. There was a lot of, they didn't name them as Black Panthers, but definitely people who were acting and looking like Black Panthers. So I was like, oh, this looks like NorCal.
Yeah, I thought Southern California just because of where I'm from, but I think Derek has swayed me on that one. I think it is a little bit more north than south.
It's hard to know. But it works either way. It's definitely, we start in California. So they put a lot of really interesting stuff going on. Of course, this was the 1960s, 1970s, racially a very tense time where Martin Luther King, at this point, has been assassinated.
He has, MLK and Malcolm X both have been assassinated.
Yeah. The Black Panthers are still around at this point. Definitely in Berkeley and Oakland, those kind of areas, those movements are still going. And when we first meet John Stewart, we see this really interesting thing where it's him and a group of black men, and they're playing dominoes on the side of the street, and they're really getting harassed by the police officers. And as they even said, we're not doing anything illegal. The police are giving them some issue like, oh, well, you need a permit to be playing a game on the street. They're like, well, no, we actually don't. And it's a very real issue that they have. And they made a really good point, actually, between the two cops. One of the cops was giving them a lot of attention, and the other one made a point. He was saying, oh, they're being disrespectful. And the other cop saying, no, they're not being disrespectful. You have to earn respect, which I thought was a really good point, right? It's not that the black community is being disrespectful to authority. They haven't been respected. They've been disrespected for so long that you got to give respect if you want to get respect, kind of thing. And yeah, it's not that they're being disrespectful. They're just trying to get equal.
Right, and John does give attitude to the police officer.
He does.
And it was only one of the two officers. The other officer just stayed back. He's the one who eventually makes the comment about respect. But John's not happy.
No.
And, rightfully so, and good for him for speaking up for himself. He didn't get violent. He didn't get belligerent. But then, of course, as you said, the officer wants to then arrest him for playing dominoes in front of, I think it was a church. There's a lot of stained glass window.
Yeah, it was definitely a perfectly normal thing.
And he's an out-of-work architect.
Yes.
Well, Derek, that's a lot of the larger context, but we always like to bring up the publisher context. What was happening in D.C. at the time?
Yes, so 1970s D.C., we're a mess in terms of our universe, right? Golden Age, Silver Age, all those kind of things, they still exist. We have our vast, crazy multiverse. We haven't gotten to any of our big crises that are going to attempt to fix it, none of which have ever really fixed it. But DC is a mess, and this was a time of creativity explosion, I feel like. They really just were throwing characters at the wall. Marvel's getting really big, too, and so I think this is definitely DC trying to stay relevant, stay politically and socially kind of on the pulse of what Americans are thinking about, and just bringing in new characters that are exciting. And
yeah, and good for them. I'm glad that they did, because it has given us this huge cast of characters, which pre-crisis, post-crisis can be impossible for my brain to want to keep up with, but you seem to do a pretty good job with it.
I try my best.
Well, let's dig into the meat and potatoes of the issue. Here we go. All right, so it starts with, the earthquake, as Derek already mentioned. And Guy Gardner, for whatever reason, I guess he's on a field trip with kids. I'm really not certain as to why he's there.
It was super unclear.
But after the Guardian shows up, we get this moment where Hal has to then go seek out this character. And it starts by saying a certain unnamed ghetto. Mm-hmm. And I did a little digging. John Stewart is a character from Detroit, so we're assuming that Hal has flown himself over to Detroit.
Yeah. But they never really tell us. It's definitely left to be that we could potentially be anywhere in America, any unnamed ghetto in America. I think really just this is the experience of the average black man is kind of where they're going for it.
Yeah. And after they meet one another, John seems pretty excited at the opportunity to be a superhero. Why not? And he smiles a lot at that point, but you can tell he's still mistrustful of Hal.
Yes.
Even to the point where he calls him Whitey at one point. Yeah. So in the context of John makes lots of little comments throughout the book, besides the one toward Hal there. And there's a point where Hal tries to correct John. And he says to John about this racist senator that they're charged with defending. Yeah. And Hal says, "You think he's a racist? Tough. Nobody appointed you judge." And I think this is one of those cases where the author is trying to show Hal's privilege, although back in 71, we wouldn't have called it that.
Right.
It would have just been demonstrating how white people have the power in society. But I really picked up on that.
Yeah, it really shows right there. We see this a lot where white people are like, well, the system will work naturally. It's going to fix the issues. Like, we don't have to worry about that. The law system will take care of that. And I think in 2026, we definitely see that's not always the case. The law definitely falls through many times. One of my family members, they're a judge, and so we asked them once, like, what type of people do you like to see within juries? And they like to say they don't like teachers in the jury because we're too judicious and we want to prove that the system works. So we want to go through every single piece of evidence and like really trust the system. But even that's like a level of privilege. Teachers are highly educated, people who've had a lot of opportunity generally. And so we see that. And like, John's coming from the perspective that the system doesn't work. So he's like, clearly this person who is a very racist senator who is running for president very soon and could potentially win, a big satire on our time for sure, looking at Nixon, he's showing that, no, the system doesn't work. Someone else, we need to put a little bit of pressure on the system if we want to stop people who are trying to do this kind of stuff.
Exactly. And I think when Hal gets called out by John, well, when John calls Hal a whitey, Hal kind of fires back and says, "Don't call me that." Mm-hmm. He's clearly offended by it because he really hasn't done anything to earn the epithet. But I think that is also the author kind of saying nobody should call anybody names. That's how I interpreted that moment.
Yeah, there's really no need for that in any way, right? As we're kind of saying, you have to earn respect if you want to give respect. It's kind of been the trend over the whole issue, is giving and earning respect, but also we have to be aware of people who are going to abuse that. But for the average person, respect and kindness really was the meaning of the issue.
Yeah, and I think as teachers, that is something that's embedded in most of us, not all, that when new students enter your class at the beginning of the year, you have to start the year by showing the respect because you are the person in power.
Yes.
And you should not expect your subordinates, if I can use that term loosely, if students can even be seen that way. But yes, there are a lot of teachers that expect the student to come in and start being respectful, but you have to give it first. And yes, you could argue, well, for a student, doesn't it work the same way? It does, but we're also talking about power structures.
Yes, and usually these students are 12, 13, 15, even 18. And I'm sure we've all had that dictator teacher. And generally we don't like that teacher because...
No, I can remember some, and I still remember their names and why I don't like them.
Right, and they assume you're going to do something wrong, and they assume they need to control you. That's not fun. But the teachers that can be really strict, but also respectful and fun, those are our favorite teachers. The ones that give us good structure and expectations.
Yeah.
We're a little off track, but...
Well, it's on track. But, so if we're going to get back on track, there's a point, again, where Hal is explaining to John to teach John a lesson about protecting people. Hal signs them up to protect this racist senator who's about to give this big speech at a convention center. And when John gets upset by this, Hal says that, well, racist nonsense is the price we pay for free speech. And I thought that was really important to put in the issue because First Amendment issues are always going to be huge in our nation. And there are always going to be people who say things that we don't like.
Right. And that doesn't mean that it's necessarily wrong. I always think back to the First Amendment. You always have the right to be offended as an individual, but that doesn't mean that they don't have the right to say what they're saying. We may not want them to, and it's very unfortunate when they do, but that is part of that power of free speech. It's just when it goes so far into wanting to call actions for violence and that kind of stuff that we start to restrict that. But I really found that a very interesting lesson that Hal was teaching.
Yeah. And free speech does come with a cost. And I had to laugh at the moment where when the senator is arriving at the airport, there's about to be an accident on the tarmac there, but John intentionally allows oil to spill out of the truck onto the senator, and the senator is really angry. And it's this moment where I looked at it and thought, well, did we just portray blackface? And John is taking amusement out of it, because John is the one who basically tarred with oil the senator, and the senator is really mad.
Yeah, he made a comment later to how about like now he knows what it was like to be black for a bit or something like that.
Yeah. But something you also picked up on was you found some satire in this issue.
Yes, because we saw this senator who was clearly running for president, and he was basically basing it on racism. He pulled up like phrenology, which we'll talk a little bit more later, and all these kind of things that he was bringing in. John put at one point he actually was trying to earn his power off the backs of the African American community, and that's why John didn't want to support him. And I think this was very poignant of the issues at the time. Of course, we were mentioning that this senator was based off of George Wallace, the Alabama governor, but we did see this a lot, where there were a lot of governors and senators who leaned harder into Jim Crow, into these racist policies, hoping to get power, and we're still seeing that today. Not just red or blue, but people who really lean into the extremes as a way to get political power.
Yeah, really good point there. And one thing that we haven't mentioned yet was sort of the conclusion of the issue, which is at this convention, a black man attempts to assassinate the senator. What we learn throughout the story is that the senator had apparently paid someone to have a black man try to kill him with blanks in his gun, but outside, the senator was going to have somebody kill a police officer and blame it on the black community.
Yeah, and then he was going to use that as justification for the more segregation and the racist stuff that he wanted to push to get himself more power. And this is just before all the nonsense that goes on with Nixon just a couple of years later. Like, there was all these political shenanigans going on. This was probably not too far from reality.
No, in fact, since you bring that up, little sidebar, it was 2019 where some new unclassified tapes had been let out from the Nixon tapes.
Oh, yeah.
Wherein we hear Ronald Reagan, who would have been governor of California at the time, but Ronald Reagan referring to delegates from Africa to the United Nations as being monkeys. So the tensions were high, folks. But of course, at the time, nobody knew Reagan said that. That's something that we've learned in 2019. But it does, I think, exemplify the racial tensions at the time. And again, talking about those power structures being in play.
It does. The other thing we wanted to mention, this senator at one point comes in with this quote during that big speech of and please check my quotes here. This is not me saying this. I've got nothing about the darkies, but it's a scientific fact that their brains are smaller than normal. And then he goes on to say, like, oh, they can't appreciate the finer things and blah, blah, blah. But what they're bringing out here, right, that's eugenics, phrenology, all these kind of racist sciences that we really saw at this time. Phrenology is that study of measurement of people's skulls. Think back to Django Unchained, right, where they're like, look, there's these 3 dots in the skull, therefore black people are more submissive. It's all nonsense. It's pseudoscience. It's not real. And I know people today who still try to spout off phrenology and eugenic ideas. And so, right, they were trying to find justification for all this racism. They tried previously through religious means, saying that there was religious ordinations about why the black community was lower, especially during the slavery time, and then they went to scientific methods. But over and over, we keep saying this is not actually valid.
Right, and interesting that you bring up the pseudoscience, because the notions of race didn't even start until after Charles Darwin had written The Origin of the Species. But in his book, he never mentions race at all. He's just looking at the animal world. People took his work and then extrapolated on it. Some twisted it. Some used it for their own means. Some today still use it for their own means. Yeah. And they just espouse this pseudoscience, which can seem like truth. Right. Because very little evidence is given. They just give generalities, and people not desiring to be educated will sometimes fall for it.
Yes, it becomes very easy to, and then there's a lot of confirmation bias too, where people already have these implicit biases, we all do, and then they found a justification in, well, oh, their head size is different, or that, well, yeah, since we all immigrated out of Africa, therefore, if you're closer to Africa, you're less evolved, which is just nonsense. But if you have confirmation bias, it's easy to just sit on that first thing that you've heard.
Yeah, and, you know, as we wrap up kind of the meat and potatoes of the issue, right toward the end, Hal comes to accept John. And Hal says, I like your style. And I love John's quote here. John says back, style isn't important any more than color. And I absolutely identified with that and thought this is the author making a point about the quality of a person over the things that make us appear different, going back to the eugenics and phrenology.
Right. Yeah. It's not just about how we appear on the outward. And right, it's John showing that none of this is what matters. What matters is really the heart inside. What type of person are you? How are you acting? What are you thinking inside? That's going to really speak more to who you are as a character and a person.
Yeah. Now let's focus on some of those fun little nuggets, those references that we found in the issue. All right, one of the first ones I picked up on was early on when Hal is trying to recruit John. John comments that his mom always called him Square. And the term Square, I think in most modern contexts, people take it to mean like a nerd.
Yeah.
But really, the term square, it's a very Masonic, Freemason term for being moral and fair. And I really like that. I was like, oh, I wonder if the author was a Mason or knew somebody who was a Mason or just had that greater sense of what the term means.
I mean, even if you just think of like carpentry, something is square when it's even and perfect and all of the corners are matching at that 90 degree. So I can see how we extrapolate that in language out to people. You're square and tight. And,
Right.
Yeah.
Be square in your actions.
Yeah.
And it's a military phrase as well. You know, square up.
Yeah. Military makes sense. Everyone's even.
100%. I loved the James Brown reference where John makes a comment when I think it was when he got his first outfit. Or when he gets the outfit, he makes the comment about how this is something cool like James Brown would wear. And I love that because the Godfather of Soul wore some great outfits.
Yeah. Talk about style.
John also used the phrase, he's going to let it all hang out. And that's a very 60s phrase. I wanted to look this up. When did the phrase come out? It seems like it was a phrase created by the hippie movement in its earliest days.
Probably for hair.
Probably for hair, but it was just this phrase that just meant kind of like, just be open and carefree. Let it all hang out. Don't hide anything. Be your genuine self.
Yeah.
And he's going to do that.
Yeah. And in the context, he did that because John refused to wear a mask. That was a big part.
Thank you. Yes, you're right.
He's the first Green Lantern who refuses to wear a mask because part of that's being like a good black role model, being a black superhero, which was a pretty big deal at this time. And that he's like, I'm not hiding myself. Plus, there's some criticism that if he hid himself, he would probably be even more targeted by the police, which is a whole nother thing. But so John's proud of who he is and being this new superhero.
Right. And for some fun little context, James Brown does use the phrase, let it all hang out, in a song released later in 1972. So this had to have been a very common phrase at the time.
It must have been, yeah.
I loved it. But speaking of clothing, what's this about the Salvation Army threads?
Yeah, so at one point, John's talking about his new outfit, right? And this is better than the Salvation Army threads. And so some people, we may have heard of the Salvation Army already. It's similar to like Goodwill or St. Vincent de Paul, these kind of places that are there to support those who are kind of down and out, where they can go for either cheap clothing or donation clothing. So he's very much making comment, as we saw, he's an unemployed architect. So he had to be basically living with hand-me-downs or just kind of thrift clothes. And so it was a really interesting little point that he made that I bet a lot of people of the time who were wearing Salvation Army threads would catch up on, but maybe the average person wouldn't necessarily think of it.
I'm glad you picked up on that because it was a fun drop, but I think it had deeper context than just a Salvation Army reference.
Right.
Well, that's going to wrap up our historical look at a very important comic book, Green Lantern 87. I'm here on Comics in Context. Naturally, there will always be those that disagree or perhaps want to add additional context. In history, that's what we do all the time, and we believe in doing it respectfully. And that brings us to a way we like to wrap up each episode, our final words.
All right, so the final thing we want to note is when Hal first sees John and the Guardian is taking him over, Hal immediately is questioning it. And Guardian immediately calls out Hal for bigotry. And Hal kind of gets defended. He's like, oh, that's not what it's about. He doesn't deny that he's being a bigot. He just denies that that's the reason that he's maybe not interested in John. But the Guardian, these supposed to be higher states of beings, they don't care about race. They don't care about these bigotries. And so I really feel like that was DC and the authors mentioning the next stage of humanity is going beyond this bigotry, going beyond our dislike of others for this stuff. That's a higher state of beings, is moving to a world where we don't worry about that kind of stuff. We still celebrate race, of course, we celebrate our differences, but really not concerning ourselves with the intolerances that we have.
Well, we look forward to having you join us again for Comics in Context. If you like what you've heard, we genuinely appreciate the like and even a subscribe if you're so inclined. Have a great day, be kind to yourself, and be kind to others.